This show is supported by Macy's. Keeping up with trends is a full-time job, but Macy's Fall Fashion Guide makes it easier. And it isn't just for your wardrobe, it's for your home too. This season, Macy's experts recommend country florals for chic, rustic charm and heirloom layers that focus on textures and vintage prints. Candy-coated electronics and tinted tablewares are also trending. Get it all this fall from Macy's Fashion Guide. Shop at Macys.com or in-store.
This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, fall 1903, President Teddy Roosevelt is in New York City. It is a rainy, cold, blustery early fall day. He boards a ship in New York Harbor and then a tugboat across towards Ellis Island, which has been the main immigration processing site for this country for about a generation or so at this point. Now, ostensibly, Roosevelt is there to examine conditions at the site. There were reports that the facilities were in disrepair, and moreover, that the processing of new immigrants was not going very smoothly. He announced, as one does, the appointment of a blue ribbon commission to look into all of this. He also met with a few families that had been stuck in processing, some of them for months. He negotiated the entry right there on the spot of one family into the country. But this was more than just about the way that one immigration facility was run. Roosevelt, as we will get into, was obsessed with immigration and what it meant for the future of this country. Race, birth rates, language, religion, assimilation, all of this was in the air, and Roosevelt was very open about the way that controlling immigration felt like it was a way to control the makeup and future of this country, which, of course, sounds very familiar, right, listeners? Anyway, here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And we have a special guest this episode, and that is Andrew Porwancher, professor of history at Arizona State University, and his latest book is American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. We will get into Roosevelt's particular complicated relationship with Jewish immigrants in this conversation as well. But Andrew, congrats on the new book, and welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with Roosevelt's visit to Ellis Island. I'm curious for all of you, let me put it this way. When he visits that island, does Roosevelt want more immigration, less immigration, or different immigration? This is why I am such a good podcast host. I ask incisive questions like that.
I like it's the multiple choice version. I guess. Yeah. I can pick A, B, or C, and then just rest on my laurels.
and then we'll read the credits and wrap it up.
That's right. It's a Scantron test, folks.
But no, Andrew. But look, Andrew. My sense of when he comes to visit here, it is a bit of a mix of okay, we need to fix this facility and how it's processing new immigrants, but also I have some deep concerns about the kind of people who are coming into this country.
Yeah, Roosevelt is a bundle of contradictions. You can often find himself contradicting himself in the same paragraph. And so it is really hard to distill coherence out of Roosevelt. And one of the things I always talk about with my students in class is trying to reckon with the historical record in its full complexity. And with Roosevelt, a figure rife with so many paradoxes, it is particularly important to resist the urge to paper over some of his self-contradictions and rather to engage them directly. And so Roosevelt, on the one hand, does at times express deep misgivings about the surge of new immigrants, as they were known, coming from places like Southern and Eastern Europe, who were distinct from the old immigrants who had been coming from Northern and Western Europe. And he is concerned about population deflation among the old stock, as it was called, at the very moment that these new immigrants are coming. And yet there are other moments where Roosevelt is deeply concerned about extending a hand to immigrant communities. He takes this visit to Ellis Island in 1903 as a signal to immigrant groups that were concerned about how their people were being treated upon entry into the country. And so Roosevelt's visit to Ellis Island is part of a broader, often self-conflicting attitude that he has towards the influx of newcomers to American shores.
Which is why, Jody, the answer to your question is, does he want fewer immigrants? Does he want more immigrants? Well, he wants both. He wants more of the right kind of immigrants, and he wants fewer of the wrong kind of immigrants. And he also wants to make sure that if people are, in the custody of the United States, that they're being treated properly, right? And you can kind of disaggregate all of those things and still have, if not a fully coherent set of words and actions, there is a coherent ideology behind it, which is that he thinks white people make better immigrants. He wants to encourage that immigration to the United States. White people in this instance mean something a little different than it does today, because all of those Eastern and Southern European immigrants who we would classify as white today aren't necessarily seen that way at the time. But he has like a set of ideas that he sees as scientific and naturalistic that he applies to human populations, and that then gets translated into what a good immigrant is.
Niki, I think that's such a good point. Like thinking about how whiteness as an identity has not quite calcified yet. And so the way that we would think of whiteness, we're like, all these people that are coming over are white. And it's like, that is not how they're being perceived. They're being perceived by their nationality. They're being perceived by their language. They're being perceived as, troublesome, or, oh, they're going to come over. They're going to have too many babies. They're not going to learn English. They're not going to assimilate. They are not being sort of welcomed into this like American identity that will take shape later. But in the beginning, these are sort of like the early moments of how we understand whiteness and how it's going to play out.
And it's being worked out in these scientific ways, right? These are the early days of eugenics. You're going to start seeing like better baby contests coming up soon. And so there is this idea that there is this old stock, which again is very much like breeding language. There's this old stock of people who aren't having enough babies. There's this new stock that are having too many babies, and that you need to sort of write this. And this language, hop onto X any day of the week, and you will see maps about birth rates and fertility and all of these things. The very same type of conversations are being had by Roosevelt around immigration in this period.
Yeah, Andrew, let's go to that kind of scientific language around race and immigration, because I think you're right. This is one of the places where we see a bit of a contradiction, because on the one hand, Roosevelt talks about treating people with kindness and decency, and that's a lot of the show that he tries to make when he's on Ellis Island itself. I think he hands someone a $5 bill, and but he then also is willing, as I think are a lot of people in this era, to talk pretty openly and bluntly and kind of like callously about race. And for instance, he's obsessed with this notion of birth rates among white immigrants as opposed to immigrants from other parts of Europe, as we've described. And this idea of, as people were putting it, race suicide, that if we don't keep the birth rates up among the right kind of immigrants, we're committing race suicide. So is that the tension you're describing? And moreover, like, what do you make of the way that people are so willing to talk so openly in terms like that?
Yeah, it's always striking as a historian when you get into the historical record, the bluntness and the candor with which historical figures share views in a way that can shock the modern conscience. And in many ways, that's very helpful as a historian when people wear their views on their sleeves so openly at the time. With Roosevelt, it's important to see that there are many Roosevelts, and the Roosevelt of the 1890s is not necessarily the Roosevelt of his presidency or his post-presidency. And so Roosevelt in the 1890s is very blunt in terms of his concerns about race suicide. And he's quite explicit that he is worried about population deflation owing to low birth rates among your, Mayflower type families. Later on, Roosevelt recast his idea of race suicide to include the children of immigrants. And what's interesting is that I found in my research more than one Jewish newspaper fashioning the birth rates in the Jewish community as evidence that Jews were helping to push back against Roosevelt's concern about race suicide. They saw themselves as being included as part of the people that Roosevelt wanted to procreate. And it's important to understand, Roosevelt was a political animal. right? He is coming of age in New York City that is fast becoming 28% Jewish. It has significant Italian population, significant Irish population. And so Roosevelt stands on issues like race suicide, on issues like immigration, have to be understood in an electoral context. Because Roosevelt is, this vote is becoming increasingly significant. And so with Roosevelt, one always has to consider this interplay between ideology, between electoral exigency, and between genuine sympathy he might have for other human beings, and that complex amalgam is always shape-shifting throughout his career.
What's fascinating about that is that you see, obviously, like Roosevelt sort of being this figure who's changing to fit his practical and pragmatic needs, but so too are the immigrants, right? They're finding in his pragmatism a space for them to make a claim to whiteness, and to say, oh, wait, we belong to this too. And in fact, we embraced your project of having more babies and pushing back race suicide. We are part of this project. And that feels so relevant to remember today as people are sort of like twisting their minds into knots, being like, well, how can all these non-white people be part of this white supremacist project? And you're like, well, there's an opening for negotiation for getting a seat at the table. And that's what you're seeing, I think, with Roosevelt as well.
Yeah, I remember this was probably the 90s when they started talking about statistics and the browning of America and how America was going to become more and more, black and brown and less white. And, that white people might become a minority. And people freaked out about this idea of losing not just their identity, but their power or their position within that sort of framework. And so all of these ideas about how I think race and power come together to shape identities around political identities is really important.
Yeah. What was the year? The 2035 or whatever it was?
Yeah.
They pinned it as, the U.S. is going to be. I think that sort of, you could probably write a story of our modern era as that notion planting a seed that sort of led to a lot of where we are now. So, look, I know it's all complicated, and I want to get to the way that, Jews and Jewish immigrants fit into all this too, Andrew. But some of the language that we've touched on, like raw political power, you've touched on obviously religion and race and the shifting notions of race. Was there also a conversation about kind of a core American identity? That's so central to what we have now, is a contested idea of what it means to be a quote unquote real American, and can people fit into that, and how do we get people to fit into that? So, what was the language around that at that time, especially with Roosevelt?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, Jody, because it gives me yet another foray into my big thesis that there are a multiplicity of Roosevelts, and sometimes Roosevelt defined Americanism in a very narrow way. And he insists that only immigrants who are willing to fully homogenize, to fully cast off any old world customs that they have, can be properly accepted and assimilated into the United States. And this is particularly evident in his embrace of a play called The Melting Pot, which debuts in 1908, just a few blocks from the White House. Roosevelt is in the audience, and actually he invites the playwright to come to the White House afterwards because he's upset because there was a joke about divorce, which Roosevelt was not a fan of. And this playwright actually takes that line out as a concession to Roosevelt. So there is this...
That was his one note for that play?
Yes, actually, yes. So there was this homogenized instinct that we see from Roosevelt. And Jews, by the way, when The Melting Pot comes out, roundly condemn it because they think that this call for assimilation, the play is really about intermarriage between a Jew and a Gentile, between a child who had survived a pogrom and grows up and falls in love with a woman whose father had actually perpetrated that very pogrom. Forgive me, listeners, for the spoiler alert. So they were on the exact opposite side from Roosevelt on this issue. They saw the play as a call for Jewish self-destruction. But there is this other side of Roosevelt where he champions certain Jewish traditions, like the Maccabees. And indeed, I call the book American Maccabee because Roosevelt was a huge fan of the Maccabees. He saw the Maccabees, these ancient Jewish rebel warriors, as embodying his masculine ideals of hardihood and courage. And so there are moments where Roosevelt is willing to honor certain elements of Jewish tradition on their own terms and see those as being able to coexist with other parts of American life, provided that they comport with other elements of his ethos. You know, Roosevelt is somebody who had grown up really as an ailing child, and his father tells him, Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. You must make your body. And Roosevelt takes it upon himself to work out in this gym that his father installs in his house. He takes up boxing at Harvard, and he spends his whole life sort of adopting this kind of machismo ethic. And he sees in Jews people who traveled a similar path from frailty to fortitude, Jews who came over malnourished from the old world. And this is at a moment when Jews are flocking to boxing gyms themselves. And so there's a kind of affinity that he sees between himself and what he sees as the Maccabee type of Jew.
Oh my gosh, it's the Maniverse all over again.
It really is in kind of two ways, right, Kellie? Like there's a very like masculine energy running over this, and his opposition to divorce plays into it as well, that marriage becomes a moral imperative, that particularly like old stock women having lots of babies becomes a moral imperative for women. But there's also this kind of muscular masculinity that is at the heart of so much of what Roosevelt does. And it's at the heart of his ideas of citizenship, too. A big thing that they're screening for at Ellis Island is illness. And there's this link in particularly immigration restrictionist imagination between illness and immigration, that they are going to make the country less healthy, less virile, less strong, and that's going to weaken the nation itself. And so all of those ideas, which are part of Roosevelt's personality, get embedded in these ideas of citizenship.
Hi, I'm Mike Troy, host of the American Revolution podcast on the Airwave Media Network. This podcast is the origin story of the United States, how we went from colonies ruled by a king to the democratic republic that we have today. The American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end. Please subscribe for free. We're available on all major podcast platforms. I hope you will join me today on the American Revolution podcast.
This day is brought to you by Uncommon Goods. Uncommon Goods makes holiday shopping stress-free and joyful with thousands of one-of-a-kind gifts that you can't find anywhere else. And the holidays, you know what? Are they here? Are they really here? Well, they certainly will be before you know it. So now is the time to head over to Uncommon Goods and snag a few things now before you get super stressed. That's what I did recently, where I found an at-home escape room kit for kids. You can create your own escape room adventure right at home. And yeah, that's one Christmas present for my daughter taken care of, checked off the list. The real issue is whether I have the willpower to put it in the closet and not break it out for the next couple months, because I'm very excited about that home escape room. Uncommon Goods has something for everyone, from moms and dads to kids and teens, book lovers, history buffs, diehard football fans to foodies, gardeners. You will find thousands of new gift ideas that you won't find anywhere else. So shop early, have fun, and cross some names off your list today. To get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/thisday. That's uncommongoods.com/thisday for 15% off. Don't miss out on this limited time offer. Uncommon Goods, we're all out of the ordinary. Fall is here, and with it comes cooler nights, heartier meals, and the craving for something warm and satisfying, which is where HelloFresh comes in, bringing you comforting, chef-designed recipes and fresh seasonal ingredients right to your door. I will tell you one thing about comfort cooking in the fall. I love it, but it can be really time and labor intensive. Lots of time in the oven, soups, baking. Sometimes I want to be able to make something quick and delicious and hearty on a weeknight. And that's where HelloFresh is stepping up. They recently doubled their number of recipes, their biggest menu refresh ever, and I've been exploring a lot of the options, including the pescatarian options. HelloFresh is helping me eat more fish. The other night, I made some herby salmon with red pepper cream sauce, and it comes with couscous, and you roast up some zucchini and onions. It took just about half an hour for it all to come together, totally doable on a weeknight, but also satisfying to cook it with your hands rather than ordering food or making something out of the freezer. The best way to cook just got better. Go to hellofresh.com/thisday10fm. You'll get 10 free meals and a free item for life, 1 per box with active subscription. Free meals applied as discount on first box. New subscribers only. Varies by plan. Once again, that's hellofresh.com/thisday10fm. You'll get 10 free meals and a free item for life.
I teach in my class this moment a lot. They used to have these melting pot ceremonies where they would have immigrants go in sort of like in their traditional, like national garb, and they would like step down into a melting pot and then come out the other side in a black suit. And it was like they had been completely assimilated. Ford used to do this at his work factories, where they would have these like almost like graduation ceremonies, and you would have your uniform, which was the black suit. You would be speaking standard American English. You would just have, a couple neat kids in your clean house with your savings account. Like there were all these sort of benchmarks that you had to check in order to like show yourself converted to this American ideology. And that melting pot was really the stripping away of a lot of people's cultural heritage.
Yeah. It's so funny. I mean, I feel like we could do an episode on this, but even, I feel like in my lifetime, you see a track a little bit from, I think I heard the notion of the melting pot, but then at some point I feel like in the 90s people started talking about, it's not a melting pot, it's a stew, right? And a stew, I like these soup metaphors. We're starting to get into the winter here, right? But like, a stew is everything's together but retains its own identity, right? You can tell that that's a potato. You can tell that that's a sausage.
The salad bowl, the salad bowl.
Or the salad bowl, right? As opposed
if you want a more summary metaphor. But Andrew, I'm curious how this works with Jewish immigrants, because one piece that we haven't lingered on is the religion element of citizenship. And obviously there's a deep anti-Catholicism at the time. And, that's particularly prominent in this era. But what is it like for Jewish immigrants to the United States? Obviously with this play, there's kind of this sense of extinction or moving away from the Jewish religion. Is there a pressure, and is that part of Roosevelt's ideas of citizenship? Where does he see Jewish immigrants in his sort of like mental map of who's an American?
Sure. Yeah, Roosevelt is relatively accepting of Jewish immigrants. What's interesting, you'd referred earlier to some of these, quote unquote scientific ideas. And Roosevelt subscribes to a particular variant of Lamarckism, a kind of social Lamarckism, this idea that, whole societies can adapt in ways that are, fitter or less fit to their particular circumstances, and then somehow biologically bequeath those qualities to their children. And so Roosevelt, interestingly, has really great regard for the Japanese, because he really admired that the Japanese had defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. And Roosevelt, he was something of a bloodthirsty colonel in the Spanish-American War. And so he has a lot of reverence for militarism. So he really admires the Japanese. But he also says, even though the Japanese are on a plane of equality with Western countries, he says the Japanese should not immigrate in large numbers to America because they're just not a good fit. Jews, on the other hand, who were coming from immiserated poverty and persecution in Eastern Europe, he did extend a relatively open hand to. And so it is striking the ways in which Roosevelt is willing to show an affinity for Jews that wasn't always present for some other groups. But Roosevelt's sympathy for Jewish immigrants, to the extent that we see it, was also mitigated by the fact that in his second term in office, he endorses what was known as the literacy test. And this was a bill that was up for debate in Congress. And it would make literacy in any language a prerequisite for admission into the country. And this bill was neutral on its face, but it would disproportionately exclude Eastern European Jews and, to your point about Catholics, Nicole, Southern Italians. And the Jews and the Italians had literacy rates much lower than immigrants from the likes of England or Denmark. And so the Catholic community and the Jewish community team up to try to disabuse Roosevelt of his commitment to this literacy test. But he proves immovable on the issue. But fortunately for these Jewish and Catholic communities, the Speaker of the House, Uncle Joe Cannon, who was something of an imperious figure, he works the floor of the House and he wrenches people by the collar up from their seats and demands that they vote against the bill. And the literacy test ultimately fails to pass, but no thanks to Roosevelt. And so there's a moment there where Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community on the issue of immigration is really strained. And Roosevelt ends up, after that bill gets defeated, abandoning that position, especially because there's an election looming that fall. And it's clear that that issue is going to alienate a lot of voters.
You talk about the sort of affinity, maybe even empathy that Roosevelt feels for a lot of Jews, even though, as you described, the waves of immigrants, especially the pogroms, take off, put some pressure on him. But does that go back to just sort of his personal experience in New York? I mean, I'll confess, we have another very powerful New Yorker with very problematic ideas about immigration and race in power right now. And I often find myself thinking man, a lot of what explains this is just kind of who did you happen to interact with growing up and what was your sort of personal experience? And I know it's complicated, but it feels like a lot of what you're describing, Andrew, is a lot about just sort of Roosevelt comes from New York. He happens to have experience with these groups and he happens to not have experience with others.
Yeah, to be sure. And I lean towards biography as a method as a historian. And so I'm always very interested in people's upbringing. And Roosevelt has exposure to a certain variety of what were called uptown Jews, the affluent, assimilated, elite Jews of Central European background. These are the kinds of people that he would have met in uptown parties in fashionable brownstones on Tony streets. These are the kind of Jew he might have met in the quad at Harvard Yard. And that's a very different kind of Jew than the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jew who is subsisting in the sweatshops of the Lower East Side. And one of the things that I found so striking in my research for this book is that Roosevelt is relying pretty much exclusively on these kind of elite uptown Jews as a spokespeople for the impoverished downtown Jews. And so Roosevelt has a Jewish kitchen cabinet, as I call it in the book. He has this circle of Jewish advisors, but he is relying on one type of Jew to speak on behalf of the other. And so there was a certain class fracture that is underneath Roosevelt's relationship and engagement with the American Jewish community.
That class fracture is really interesting in these coalitions because you also see it in Black activists when they're working with the Roosevelt the other Roosevelt administration, actually both Roosevelt administrations. But it's just so much more likely that someone in that position of power is going to have connections to unusually wealthy and well-connected Jewish people or Black people, and they're going to be able to open a door or open a window to their communities, but it's going to be a kind of narrow one that's going to cause a lot of friction.
Yes, I'm thinking of Booker T. Washington.
Yeah.
He's the first, Roosevelt's one of the first presidents, first presidents ever to meet with Booker T. Washington, which causes a lot of friction. But also the idea that Booker T. is the model Black citizen and he's willing to acquiesce or accommodate to white supremacy is another reason why he's upheld as the standard.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really talked about kind of Roosevelt's relationship with not people who were trying to immigrate to this country, but were brought to this country. Did the sort of empathy and understanding of the dynamics among white immigrants from Europe affect his understanding and empathy for African Americans?
It's a really interesting question because Black history becomes part of Roosevelt's story with the Jewish community in a really striking way. One of the central issues in Roosevelt's presidency was, how do you deal on the diplomatic stage with these pogroms, this spate of mob violence that is claiming Jewish lives by the hundreds and thousands? And there was tremendous pressure for Roosevelt to speak out. Jews and Gentiles alike are protesting in the United States, demanding that the president diplomatically intercede on behalf of these embattled Jewish communities. And Roosevelt has some sympathy, but also some reluctance because of America's own scourge of mob violence directed at a marginalized minority. There is a striking parallel between pogroms in Eastern Europe and the lynching of Black Americans. Both involve mob violence, both involve the tacit consent of local authorities, both involve a spurious pretext for inflicting violence on somebody who had allegedly done wrong with little to no evidence. And Roosevelt is very aware of the fact that he risks looking like a hypocrite. And in fact, when he does criticize Russia, the Russians are very quick to publicly reference America's own raft of extra-legal killings, inflicting violence on Black Americans. And one of the things that I note in the book is that, Roosevelt, he acknowledges that, yes, we do have this problem with lynchings, but he says far more people have been killed in the pogroms. It's a far worse crime. Just the opposite was true. The reality is that far more Blacks had been lynched at that point in time. And the fact that Roosevelt repeatedly asserts this falsehood, I think, suggests that there is a greater sympathy that Roosevelt can more easily muster for the Jewish community than he's able to muster for the Black community. But I'll add, just as a coda, that a number of Jews in America who see these striking parallels between the pogroms and lynching work with Black leaders to help found the NAACP. And so there is an important way in which the Jewish community helped stand up for the Black community. And conversely, when word of the pogroms reached American shores, the first major pogrom of the wave that crest during Roosevelt's presidency, there's a group of Black lawyers in Louisville who convene and have a protest meeting calling on the government to intervene on behalf of these embattled Jews. Wow. And they are inspired by their own struggle against extra-legal violence.
Wow.
Well, let's wrap it up, but let's bring it back to this moment that we're marking here where he goes and he visits Ellis Island, because there's actually we'll put it in the newsletter. There's a sort of very well-written New York Times account of this that's very sweeping and kind of paints the picture and so forth. But, I mentioned this in the intro, but like he actually kind of meets with a family. I think they have 5 kids, and he, on the spot, frees them. Incidentally, they were being held up because there were fears, as Niki mentioned, that they had a disease, trachoma, this bacterial eye infection, and so there was, fears of that. But I bring it up just because one other element here, he clearly understands the media environment. He clearly understands the spectacle. He clearly understands attention, right? And I think that is obviously a huge part of the dynamic now about how we think about these issues is just what gets people's attention and their emotions up. So he was balancing that too.
Interesting that empathy was the thing that he was leaning on in order to win kudos.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. All right. Well, Andrew Porwancher, professor of history at Arizona State, and the book is American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews, available everywhere, I'm assuming.
Indeed.
Indeed. All right. Well,
support your local bookstores.
Exactly. We'll put a link to bookshop.org in our notes and in our newsletter. But Andrew, thank you so much for doing this. It's really fascinating.
Thank you for having me. We had a great time.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia, a network of independent, artist-produced podcasts. Don't forget to sign up for our America250 Watch newsletter. Every Thursday, members get exclusive access to analysis and information about the upcoming semi-quincentennial, commentary from our team, and a list of fascinating things that happened that week throughout history. Join in, find out lots more at thisdaypod.com. You can also follow This Day Pod on Instagram, Blue Sky, and YouTube. Jacob Feldman is our researcher. Brittany Brown is our editor. My name is Jody Abergan. See you soon.
Radiotopia.